So overall, I'm not overly concerned about that, at least not from an economic point of view. I don't think that's part of the Chinese rationale. Also, all the designs that are implemented in Taiwan are either done in the United States or done in Japan. So you'd have to assume that the Americans and the Japanese would then become complicit in the invasion. I think that's a bit of a reach. Beyond that, the Chinese Navy, while they do have more ships than the U.S. Navy, most of them are very, very small, and 90% of them can only sail 1,000 miles from the coast, assuming they're sailing in a straight line, moving slowly to conserve fuel, and no one is shooting at them. So they can't even make it past Vietnam in force. So in the instance of a war, whoever the Chinese would be warring with, someone, the Koreans, the Taiwanese, the Vietnamese, the Japanese, the Indians, us, someone is going to put a couple of destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin and cut the energy line. The United States hasn't been the world's top energy importer for a long time. It's been China. China imports 85% of their energy, and 85% of that comes from the Persian Gulf. So in a real war, that stops. And China literally deindustrializes in a matter of months. The trucks stop running probably in 3 to 6 months, and you'll have mass famine in 6 to 12 that'll kill 500 million people. Now, normally I would say that this would prevent the Chinese from seriously considering any sort of conflict. But as we're ending the edge of the globalized era, the math is changing. They realize now that they don't have a lot to lose, or more to the point, they're going to lose it anyway. And there's something to be said for choosing the time and place of the conflict so that you can write the narrative. And if for the low, low price of 500 million dead Chinese, the Communist Party can remain in control during the transition, that's a price worth paying. So I'd give it like a 1 in 3 chance that it's going to happen. Let's start with the Chinese view about what's going on. When the war first started, they were really excited because they had always seen this as a potential template. You know, the Russians conquer Ukraine quickly, the world sucks it up, and Ukraine ceases to exist. The Russians absorb it. The Russians pay no real diplomatic or economic price, and we go back to a multipolar world in which the Russians are bigger, and everyone has just decided to accept the done deal and move on. Yeah, that's not happening. So number one, Ukraine, while they're massively overperforming, has really only been preparing for this war for 8 years and did not have a lot of financial resources to do so. Taiwan has been preparing for war with China for 75 years, and they are a wealthy country, and there is not a flat land border between China and Taiwan. It's an ocean. So there's always going to be a much higher level of casualties and a much higher level of difficulty, and now the Chinese know that. Two, the sanctions. I got to admit, I'm really surprised that the world came together, especially Europe, in the way that it did so quickly. If those sanctions were put against China, it would destroy the regime. Say what you will about the Russian economy, but it is a large net exporter of energy, foodstuffs, and the stuff that is necessary to grow foodstuffs. The Chinese are huge importers of all of those things. So the same exact sanctions put against China would destroy the place in less than a couple of months. But I think the one issue that has terrified the Chinese the most is that the boycotts. Everybody's left Russia, and that is the development model for China. They need that for the market access. They need that for the technological transfer. If they didn't have foreign corporations operating, they'd be dead. And the most horrifying part is that consumers, individual people, have been able to pressure companies to leave Russia. The Chinese don't even admit that that's a force in the world, individuals. So everything that they thought they knew, everything that they thought was a base assumption that was fine, has been ripped apart in the last 6 weeks. And they now have to start from scratch. And they can't. Because Xi has established a cult of personality that is so airtight that there's no one left in China with intellectual capacity that he hasn't exiled or imprisoned or intimidated into silence or flat out killed. He's the only one who can make decisions on anything anymore. And now he has to start from scratch while also ruling a country of 1.4 billion people. It's beyond him. And so we are seeing cascading, compounding failures throughout the Chinese system right now. Probably the best example going on right now is the COVID lockdowns. The Chinese vaccine doesn't work. It barely worked against the original strain out of Wuhan. It was like 55% effective at preventing death, but it did nothing for severe disease. It did nothing for infection. Well, we're 4 variants down now with Omicron B, and the Chinese vaccine is useless against it. So their only possible tool is a full lockdown. But this thing is more communicable than measles. So right now we've got 65 cities in lockdown, the biggest of which is Shanghai, and Guangzhou is probably going to go into lockdown this coming week. And so the Chinese are no longer even reliable partners in supply chain manufacturing because they can't fight the virus effectively. So we're seeing China removing itself by bit or chunk by chunk from the entirety of everything that we've always associated with China, most notably in manufacturing. And so one of the fun things with some of my clients right now is, I've been telling people for years that in some way this relationship was going to end. It could be because of trade or because of security or because of ethics or because of the genocide or because of jobs or because of populism. Any of these factors could completely torpedo the relationship. So you need to start planning for what is going to be your next scheme for supply. And a lot of them who have chosen not to do anything are now calling me. They're like, what do we do? I'm like, well, 3 years ago, here's what you should have done, if you remember. But there's limited labor in the United States and Mexico because of that demographic transition. And so the first mover advantage has gone to certain companies, and everyone who's late to the game now has to figure out how to do something completely from scratch with new infrastructure in a new place. You don't do that in 6 months.
Right.
No, it does. It does. The problem with answering that is we have a cult of personality. And the only person who knows what's going on in Chinese policy for projecting forward is one guy who now has no one to talk to.
Right.
So, for example, the United States has been able to somehow, through some excellent work, basically read Putin's email and the emails and the phone records of everyone in the inner circle and everyone in military planning. And so when we getting within a couple of weeks of the invasion, the Biden administration just started dropping this out there. And a lot of countries didn't believe it, but we now know in retrospect that they had everything. And my personal favorite is when the NSC published a couple of emails from their counterparts in Russia complaining about the NSC reading their emails. That was just funny.
Thanks.
That doesn't work in China. Putin has isolated himself. He only has about a dozen people he sees regularly. He only has about a half a dozen he trusts. But Xi has no one. And so no one is willing to bring Xi information unless it's specifically requested. Because it doesn't matter if it's good news or bad news. It's news. And if it clashes with what's going on in his head, they're out ahead. So our best understanding is that when Putin came to Beijing, which, by the way, was the first world leader that Xi had met with since January of 2020, he's that isolated. He believed everything that Putin told him because no one in his own intelligence services dared say anything. And so when the invasion actually did happen, Xi was shocked because Putin lied to his face.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there was a bit of a purge within the remaining people who serve Xi, and so he's even more isolated now.
Sure.
So we just don't know, and more importantly, Xi doesn't know. And he has now removed himself from all capacity for learning and adapting.